Hey guys, it's Mr. Morales. Today we're going to talk about the British rule of India. All right, so our target today, what we're trying to understand, is understanding how the British ruled in India and how that rule still has an effect on us today. All right, let's take a look. All right, so the British colonial rule is really divided into two parts. At the top, you have the East Indian Company, an actual company like Google or Apple that ruled that entire country from 1757 to 1858. Now, the next section would be what they call the British Raj, and that ruled from 1858 to 1947. And Raj seems like a very fancy word, but actually it just means rule, okay? Which brings us to the next point. As you're going through this, you should be completing your Google form that was assigned as well. So you can pause this video at any time. You can pull up your Colonial India Google form and you can look. Why do they call it the British Raj? Raj simply means British rule. So you click it, and then you go on. You're going to watch this for a few minutes, stop, and go back and forth. And that'll be a lot quicker than trying to search it up in Google, because if you do that, it's going to take you a very long time. All right, let's get going. So the British rule of India. So where to start? It started with the spice trade routes to India and China. Basically, Europe looked around and saw a bunch of cool stuff over in the Far East. And they were like, we want this stuff to come back here so we can sell it. The problem, you either had to take this huge land routes, which are all marked in the red, which took forever and were very expensive. Or you get on a boat, you get off your boat at the corner of the Nile, you pack it through, you get in the Red Sea, go all the way down, and then make it that way. Still long, very dangerous. So they wanted to go there, but it was far away. Now, why did they want to go there? First of all, India. India has a ton of stuff, all right? First and foremost, they had spices, rare spices. Now, people wanted spices, obviously, for the taste of it. We still use spices for that today. But they also wanted it to preserve food. So they used salt to preserve food, but some of these other spices extended the length of it. Remember, no refrigeration. So if you can extend food, that's a good deal. Also, medicine. You had spices like cinnamon, turmeric, cumin that actually help people if they're ill. So medicine was another reason. And finally, and most importantly, it was to show you had a bunch of cash. You get your spices, throw them out on your table, have a big wedding. There were kings and queens and royalty that would put out, I mean, we're talking 50, 100 pounds of spices. The more spices, the more bling you had, the wealthier you seemed, right? The other thing is cotton. And cotton they used to produce textiles over there in India. Now, textiles are basically woven cloth. So it could be a napkin, a towel, clothing, anything that's made of cloth. Now, the British, the rest of Europe wanted this stuff. They had these beautiful colors. It was well done. They would take it back and sell it at a huge markup and make lots of cash. They also wanted silk textiles. Now, most people think of silk as China, but India had been producing silk, see the silkworm down here, for thousands of years by the time the British get there. So again, silk textiles as well. And the other thing are cash crops, right? Now, there was a demand for things like tea in Europe, but you couldn't grow it in Europe. But if you go into India and you convince them to grow that, either by force or by persuasion, then you can make a lot of money. So cash crops were another thing that drew people there. Also, India, at that time, it's the #1 country in terms of GDP in the entire world. 25% of every single thing that was produced in the world started right there. So it was a big deal. The problem, again, it took a long time to get there. So all of a sudden, this dude comes up, Vasco da Gama. He's from Portugal. He figures out that you can sail from Portugal over here, all the way down to the bottom of Africa, down below the Cape of Good Hope, through the Strait of Madagascar, up here, bam, and you're there, right? Suddenly, it's quick. So now everyone starts to go. You have the Portuguese there, the French there, the Dutch there, the Danish there. And Europe, all of Europe wants to get there to get this stuff, and they start putting these settlements up. The British are like, hey, we want to go there too. So in 1600, Queen Elizabeth founds the East Indian Company. Now, it's a private company like Google or Apple or Walmart. And they say, look, you're the only British company that can go to India and the Spice Islands. Now, today we call the Spice Islands Indonesia. But this is where all the good stuff was. Now, the East Indian Tea Company is eventually going to become so powerful that it's going to rule almost all of India. Now, they even come up with their own money. So instead of like using British pounds, they have East Indian Company script that they pay people in. Very powerful. If you remember the East Indian Company from last year, if it rings a bell, it's because the Boston Tea Party, that was the East Indian Company's tea that the Americans overthrew in Boston Harbor. So you should recognize that from last year as well. Now, when they get there, it's not like India is just running around with no rulers. They had the Mughals. Now, the Mughals were like descendants of the Mongols, who had this huge empire. But the Mughals were an Islamic empire. They'd taken over in 1530. and they'd pretty much taken over the whole continent. Now, by the time the British get there, they're starting to lose a little bit of power. And over the next 100 years, they're basically going to be reduced to just a small area here and there throughout India. And the East Indian Company is going to take over, and later the British government. So you can look here. In 1757, after 100 years or so, you see where the East Indian Company has gained all this area in yellow. And then slowly it goes into India. And eventually by 1857, it controls almost all the coastline. And remember, you control the coastline, you control shipping, trade, cash, right? Now, how do you do this? You've only got a few British people there. Well, you hire people to be your own private army. And so the East Indian Company created their own army. It'd be like Google having their own army. They got native Indians from all religions, and they served. Now, this was a good deal. The problem is, from time to time, you'd have rebellions, and you had to rely on these soldiers to put down those rebellions. Well, once the big rebellion came in 1857, it wasn't by the people in India, it was by the sepoys, their own military themselves, and it was over a cartridge. Now, a cartridge, we use bullets today. Back then, they used cartridges, because what you had to do is a piece of paper here. Inside the paper, you had gunpowder. Below, you had bullet, and you had grease all around the bottom edges right here. You would take it, put it in your mouth, bite this tip off here, pour down the gunpowder here. Then you would turn it this way with the grease first, put it straight down, and tamp it down. Sounds cool. You could fire it. You had the whole bullet in one like little neat cartridge. The problem was a rumor went around that said that the bottom of the cartridge in grease was coated in pig and cow grease, right? So for the British, who were mostly Christian, it wasn't a big deal, right? What do they care about the rumor? But in India, it was a big deal, because in Hinduism, cows are sacred. In Islam, pork is haram, which means you can't touch it. So you're definitely not allowed to eat it. So what are you doing? You're making a cartridge where the two largest religions in India are having to violate their vows. So this made people angry, and there was a huge rebellion. Now, what made it worse? 96% of their troops, of 300,000 troops about, were sepoys. All right, so they had to convince some sepoys to be on their side. And luckily for them, they did. They were able to stop the rebellion, remove them from power. But as a result, the British government said, the East Indian Company is no more in India. They kick them out, and the British government takes over from this point. So in 1857, it's now part of the British Empire. The problem is they look around and they see all these different languages. Look, every single color has a different language. How do you conduct business like this? Well, the East Indian Company had started teaching English, and the British government really presses it. So now law, trade, education, and government, it's all taught in English. Now, this is the legacy of British colonial rule. You go to India today, tons of people speak English, and it's because of the British. The other thing that you'll see if you were in India today are the railroads. This started under the British as well. The East Indian Company did it first. Later, the British government continued it. They built railroads and bridges. Now, this is called infrastructure. So bridges, roads, anything that comes together to make a society work, that's called infrastructure. Now, the good part about this was that trade and transportation were cheaper and faster. Technology and ideas spread across India all of a sudden, right? Because everything's connected. But the negatives were high taxes. Building them were dangerous. And the British weren't building them. It was the Indian people themselves. And initially, most natives, they're not allowed to even ride inside or gain good jobs from the railroad. Now, this is going to change later on. And today, the largest employer in all of India is the National Railroad System. Agriculture before the British, this was a big change. When the British weren't there, they grew wheat and rice. And they did subsistence farming. If you remember subsistence farming, where you're farming a crop for food, not for export. So if I grew a bunch of wheat, had a little bit of stuff left over, I would pay my landlord in my taxes. I would keep that extra wheat, store it. And if there was a bad year, if there was a crop failure, I had food. Well, when the British come in, they start taxing the landlords, they start taxing the farmers, and all of a sudden, people have to take out loans to keep their land. They lose their land because they can't pay the loans, and farmers and landlords who like the British, who work with the British, tend to take over. So all of a sudden, surpluses are no more. They sell those surpluses for cash because now it's more of a business, all right? And instead of growing wheat and rice, a lot of farmers are forced to switch to cash crops. Tea, coffee, opium, cotton. All this stuff can be shipped out, but you can't eat it, right? So cash crop, remember, are crops grown for export and profit. So what happens is that one of the cons of this system is that when there's a drought, all of a sudden you don't have this stored surplus to eat, right? You got to go out and buy your food. Well, if you don't have any money, you can't buy your food. So there were years when there were famines, and famines are times of starvation due to lack of access to food, where people actually, there was food there, but they couldn't buy it. All right. Now, the pro side of this, the positive side, was that agriculture did grow 500% up under British rule in less than what, 60 years? So there were negatives and positives. Now, if you look at the economy before the British, India was the #1 economy in the world. Again, 25% of the world's GDP was in India. Now, if you notice, the US isn't even here because it's 1700, right? Now, here's how it worked. India, before the British, they had cotton. They would take that cotton, and there was a raw material. They would spin it into yarn. The yarn would go to what today we call factories. Back then, it was just like a bunch of people working together. And then from there, those factories would export it to places like, say, Europe. When it got to Europe, they would get paid cash, and all this cash would go back to India, and it would stay there. So their economy, they had jobs, they were exporting, they were making money, and it was staying in India. But when the British get there, they change it. They say, okay, here's the cotton, but instead of you doing the cotton, we're going to take the cotton and send it straight to England. So when it gets to Britain, they're going to do it in their factories. Remember, they're having the Industrial Revolution now, so it's booming over there. They take all this raw material, they weave it into clothes, and then they export it back to India. And India has to end up buying clothing that they used to make themselves. Now they're buying it, and that money isn't going to India. It's going to England, right, to the British. So they totally switched it around. So you can look here. When they started, India is #1. By 1820, India is #2. By 1890, India is #3. By 1930, India is #5. Now, part of this is because of the British policies. The other part is that, again, you had the Industrial Revolution, but the British didn't invest in factories there, right? So they weren't booming like other places. And then you had other countries that weren't even there at the start, like the United States. So if you look over here in this corner in 1930, the United States is the #1 nation in the world, and it didn't exist in that. So there's lots of things going on, and India wasn't being modernized enough, all right? So economy under the British. The positives, there were large amounts of exports, actually, but it was raw materials, right? Which isn't good. You want to make stuff. Modernization in some areas, but not enough modernization. GDP drops to just 4%. So at the end of British rule, it went from 25% to just 4% in 1947. Now, they did have education there. They did allow women to go to school. They did develop some universities, but it was mostly for upper class Indians. Okay, they were hoping to train the wealthy people, the elite, to help them rule. Now you can look over here on the right and see when in 1872, only a little bit over 3% of all native Indians can read. By the time they leave, this is 1941, so it's going to end in 1947. But 6 years before the British leave, only 16% of the people can read. And women are down at 7.3%. Today, it's 74%, but women still are just reading 66%. So the takeaway is that the British did start an education system, but they never invested in the 1800s and 1900s early on like the rest of the developed world was, and India kind of still feels that today. Now, the political effects, during this whole time when the British were ruling, they didn't do anything to unite the Hindu and Muslim populations. And so as soon as the British were out, literally they started splitting up, and that's why we have Pakistan and India and Bangladesh today. They failed to do what you have to do for a nation, which is united. Now, India's government did end up being a parliamentary system, so it's a type of democracy. That's straight. That's another legacy from the British. They also have specific freedoms like speech and religion. All those things that we have here in the United States that they have in England was set forth. It comes from the British. So there were some positive effects of British. Finally, you're going to see that British rule ends in 1947, shortly after that big event called World War II. Basically, it's really hard to tell the rest of the world that you're fighting for freedom against the Nazis and the Japanese Empire when you have colonies yourself. In addition, you see the rise of people who are fighting for the freedom of Indians, like Mahatma Gandhi over here and his nonviolent movement. So all of this together is going to result in the British pulling out of India. All right, that concludes for today. If you have any questions, remember, you can get on Google Meet and ask your teachers for anything that you need. Have a good day.